right. I think we can get started. So hello, everybody, and welcome to this talk about tracking data with the Adobe Client Data Layer. So I'm Jean-Christophe Kautzmann. I'm a software engineer at Adobe, working in the AEM Sites team. And I will co-present this talk with Laurentiu and Ben. So I will let them introduce themselves.
Hey, my name is Laurentiu, and I'm a software engineer working in the commerce team.
Hi everyone, my name is Ben and I'm based in Zurich, Switzerland. I'm working for Adobe as a consultant and expert in Adobe Experience Platform, Adobe Analytics, Target, and Launch.
Okay, thank you. So what we would like to go through today is first talk about the Adobe Client Data Layer, then discuss about the integration of the data layer with the AEM Core Components. So the core components are basic components that can be used on the page, like title, text, teaser, and so on. And then we'd like to go through the integration of the data layer with the custom components. And finally, Ben will drive through the integration of the data layer with Adobe Launch and Adobe Analytics. So the Adobe Client Data Layer. First question, what is a data layer? So the data layer is basically a store used on the client side that has two uses. First is to collect data about the page and the visitor's experience. And once we collect data, it helps to communicate this data to digital analytics like Adobe Analytics or Adobe Target. So the Adobe Client Data Layer, what does it do? So again, it's a JavaScript store. And there is a very basic API to do four basic stuff. So first, you want to register data into the data layer. You can trigger events in the data layer. So events happening on the page. You can get the current state of the data layer. And of course, you want to register listeners that can be called for specific events. So we'll go now through some example and code how to do that. So first thing you need to do is to load the script on your web page. So you would use, for example, a script tag with, here we use the defer and async attributes. So this makes sure that the script loads after all other scripts have loaded, so it doesn't get into the way of other scripts on your page. You then declare the Adobe Data Layer object as a window object. So as you can see here, it's an array. So it's a out-of-the-box JavaScript array. Once you have declared, you can start pushing data into this array. And actually, you use the push methods, so the generic JavaScript push methods, to push data into your array. And here, for example, I'm pushing a page object with a few properties. Here are only the title of the page. So you can also push event objects, and this happens by using the event keyword. You also have the optional event info keyword where you can add some information about your event. And you can push events. And together, when pushing events, you also have the option to also modify the state of the data layer, like to push more data or more components into your data layer. To delete data, you can use either the null or the undefined object. So in the first case, I'm removing the map1 object, and with the undefined keyword below, I remove the first item of the shown items array. To update an existing array, you just append an item into the array, like it's done here. And now comes the interesting part. So we've seen that you can push data, you can push events, and you can also push functions. So here I'm pushing an anonymous function, and you can see that I get here DL argument of the function, and this is representing my data layer objects. So as soon as the script has loaded, all items in the array will be processed, and when the function item is processed, it gets executed, what's in the body of the function. So, and when this happens, I have the data layer object augmented with a few methods. So I have the getState method that is added, and the add event listener, and the remove event listener. We'll go through those three methods now into more details. So first, the getState. This returns the merge state of the data layer. So I have an example here. Sorry, so here you can see that I have a specific structure. At Adobe, we recommend to use the XDM schema, but everybody is free to use what suits the needs of the company. So here, for example, I have a page object with a few properties, with the title property. I have the component object, and below the component object, I have all my components added as a flat structure. That's a choice we made for the core components. You can also get the merge state of a specific part of the state. So here, I only want to know the state or the properties of the objects defined by the dot notation, the component.hero1. What I get as an output is a list of properties. Here, the title and the link of the specific objects I configured before. Of course, you can register an event listener. So this happens very similarly to the native add event listener JavaScript function. So you can see here, I have first the property, the event name, then the handler, and I have the another option. Here you can see the path. So I can define the path of the object which I would like to listen to. So whenever there is a change to this specific object, my listener will be triggered. As you can see here, I trigger the callback when the Adobe Data Layer change event happens. And with the Adobe Data Layer, we have two out-of-the-box events. So it's the first one is this change event. Whenever there is a change, something added to the array, then this event gets triggered. There is another one, it's called the Adobe Data Layer event. And this is actually an event that is triggered whenever I push an event to the data layer array. Here is an example of a console output. Because I'm listening to Adobe change event, I get all the change. The first one is data that has been added to the data layer. And the second one is this event that has been added as well to the data layer. Of course, I can unregister my listeners. First example, unregisters all the callbacks for this Adobe Data Layer change event. And my second example, I can specify a handler which should be unregistered based on the event clicked. That's it for this first section. Again, this is an open source project. We are happy to get your contributions. So I will now pass the microphone to Laurentiu for the next part of the talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Christophe. Now, let me show you how the core components provide an out-of-the-box integration with the Adobe Data Layer. So, as you've seen, the data layer is a client-side utility that helps you decouple the data from applications and enable you to build data-driven client-side features. So you have scripts that generate and push data and generate and push events, and you can have your own scripts that read that state or handle those events as you may need them. So you're pretty much able to do whatever you want with it. But the way the core components integration was designed was with components in mind. So every component that will be present on a page will produce data, and that data will be collected and pushed into the Adobe data layer once the page is fully loaded. Now, not every component produces data. For example, you have separators which don't really have any meaningful information, so those are not going to produce any data and will not be present into the data layer. The way the data ends up in the client side is using a JSON structure that is rendered in a data HTML attribute in the HTL that belongs to that component. So we take information from the actual model and render it into this data attribute. Now, once the page is fully loaded, we use some client libs. We have a common client lib designed especially for this data layer integration that will just query the page for this data CMP data layer attribute, will fetch that data, will push everything into the data layer, and then push an event, CMP column loaded, that is useful for listeners that may want to know when all the data is available so they can start reading the state and work on whatever was loaded in there. Another important piece of information, just as Jean-Christophe mentioned, are events, because this indicate how the user interacts with the page. Now, the great majority of events and interactions with the page are done via clicks. So to make this easy, we just marked every clickable element in the components that are relevant with the CMP clickable data attribute. Now, the same client lib that we're using to load the data is also querying for this attribute in the DOM and attaches event handlers on them. That event handler is responsible for pushing the actual event into the data layer together with a payload. That payload contains the component ID to help you know which component the user interacted with. So this is why it's very important to have IDs on the HTL, unique IDs that identify the component. For custom events, you have special events like showing or hiding certain items. For example, accordions or carousels will have animations that basically just show or hide certain items. And for those, the core components uses the component-specific client lib, where that animation is actually generated. It's the same place we also generate the events for the data layer. Now, in order to know if the data layer integration is enabled or not, and I didn't mention this here, is by using another data attribute that is present on the body tag. So if that data layer attribute is present on the body tag, it means that it is enabled, and your scripts can then go on and generate or consume events. So it's just a flag, but it's an important one. The structure of the data layer information that is generated by each component has more or less these attributes here. Not all of them are used in every component, but I think this is a list with all of the attributes that you may find. This is based on the XDM componentized page schema, and it was chosen because we have componentized pages here, and it's also makes it easy if you are to use Adobe Experience Platform services You may design your schema for your service to be based on the componentized page schema, and this will make it very easy to load the data as it is into the Adobe Experience Platform. Well, of course, you're not conditioned to do so. You are free to do your own transformation before pushing the data, but if you go with the default use case, then it will make it very easy for you to push this data into AEP. So the way we generate that JSON that I talked about is by implementing some methods which come from the component interface, which is the interface that all of the components from the core components project are based on. So these two important methods is the get data and the get component data. The first one is a public one, and it will be used in the HTL to generate the JSON, and the second one, it's a protected one, and it's the one that it's actually called by the get data method. So this one is responsible for returning an instance of the component data interface, which defines all the attributes that may end up in that final JSON structure. So in here we have a default implementation, but we can use custom implementation for special components that, for example, containers that have elements, child elements. Those can be another implementation. That can be another implementation. That implementation here, as you can see, it relies on the component itself, the component that generates the data, and the resource associated with it. Now, by default, a component will generate at least two attributes. The first one is the ID, and the second one will be the type. And as you can see here, is based around the resource. Now, any other attribute that you may want ending up in that final JSON structure needs to be generated by overriding some methods in your own component, the component that generates this data. So inheriting the component interface, you get all these data layer specific methods. All of these have default implementations returning null. So if you want any attribute ending up in the final structure, you just need to override this to return a non-null value, and then you'll have everything ending up in on the HTL script in that JSON structure. Now, to benefit from all that integration that I just mentioned earlier, you need to enable it first. And as with any feature in AEM, you probably need to use, and you should use, a context-aware configuration. Now, this context-aware configurations has just a simple Boolean property that you need to set it to true. I will not go into the details. You can find all the information about how to enable this on the GitHub repository page, and you'll have all the details in there. Now, integrating this with your custom components. Of course, you will have custom components in your project, and you can leverage the existing integration from the core components to also put the data from your custom components into the data layer and not work too much for it. So you can leverage this and add your own custom logic. You are free to use whatever approach you want, as long as in the HTL, in the DOM elements that belong to your components, you have that data HTML attribute with the JSON structure, as long as you mark all the elements as clickable and so on. So basically, you need to define the properties of your custom component that need to be tracked. So this is up to you. You define whatever needs ending up in the data layer. You should add a component ID in the custom component HTL. As I mentioned earlier, this is important for events. So when a component produces an event, that event usually contains the component ID, and this makes it easier to also identify it in the DOM. So this should be there. Add your data layer CMP data layer attribute to the custom component HTL and generate that JSON structure from your model. So basically the HTL, the root element of your HTL should look something like this. So you'd have the ID, which should be unique, and then you'll have that JSON structure that can be generated in any way you see fit. But you can also use the same approach as was used in the core components, and it will definitely make things easier if your project is large, and you will end up reusing lots of code. So the minimum that you'll have to do is create your custom component data implementation, the one that is responsible for generating that JSON. So you just implement the component data interface that is exposed by the core components bundle, and override your own methods that need ending up in the final JSON structure. Now, the way the JSON is generated is by having a top level attribute, which is the component ID, and then below that you have all the other attributes. Now, this is the way it was preferred by the core components team, but again, you're free to use it wherever you like. But we find this a lot easier to work with within the data layer, because it's easy to navigate the structure and identify your component by this ID. Now, once you define this custom component data implementation, you can just use it in your custom model. If your custom model also implements the component interface, that makes things a lot easier, because all you have to do is just leverage those two methods that I mentioned earlier, the get data and the get component data. And the second one should just return your custom model implementation, an instance of this, and you're pretty much ready to go. For events is pretty straightforward. So we talked about clickable elements. So you just mark those with the data CMP clickable attribute, and client lib for the data layer integration will take care of adding event listeners and pushing the data when event occurs. Just make sure that the HTL has an ID. And for the custom events, the ones with animations that I talked earlier, you should probably use the same approach with generating that event from within the client lib associated with the component, because, well, it's probably where you also generate the animation itself, so it's the perfect spot to generate the event as well. Just leverage that data attribute on the body tag to see if the integration is enabled or not. Now, I will quickly show you, I think we still have a few minutes left. I will quickly show you a custom component that I was working on for the commerce SIF components. So I can show you how it looks like for a product. So we'll just pick a product and inspect the DOM to see how that attributes ended up. So yeah, this is the top element for this product, and you can see it has an ID, a unique ID here, and the data layer structure is also present, having that same ID and the rest of the attributes below that. We can also see the state of the data layer to see how it looks like. So as you can see, that was picked up by the client lib, and everything was pushed, everything was present on the page. We can also find this product here together with all the attributes. We can also see that the loaded event was triggered by looking at the raw data from the Adobe data layer. Here you can see the order that the components were pushed. So we have the page, which was pushed first, and then we have components. The last one was the product, and then you have this event, which is CMP loaded. Now, if I had any listeners, event handlers register for this event, I will have been notified in my code, and I could have gone through it and read all the data that's available. So I can also quickly, no, I don't think we have time. I'll answer any questions in the question section. I'll pass it on to Ben. Thank you.
So now you can see me. Perfect. Thanks, Laurentiu, for this nice overview. So for now, we have seen how you can push data into the data layer. What I'm going to talk about now is how we can use that data in our website in order to get some nice tracking. Adobe Launch is our tag manager, and we've built an extension to interact with this Adobe Client Data Layer. And what capabilities do we offer? You have the ability to rename the default object from Adobe Data Layer to whatever name you want to use. If you're not running this on AEM with the data layer enabled, you could still use the extension and it would inject the data layer library automatically for you. Then I would say the primary use case here is listening to data layer pushes, right? So that's what I'm going to focus on now. And we can also retrieve the computed state of the data layer in the UI of our tag manager, and we can also access specific elements from there. I have some slides which are gonna be shared later with you where you will find more information, but now I wanna show you how it actually looks like and go into the UI. So here you can see I've set up a demo in our Adobe Launch Tag Manager, and I've actually installed 3 extensions. I'm going to use the core, which is there all the time. I'm going to show you how we can interact with Adobe Analytics, and then our brand new one, it's the Adobe Client Data Layer. For those wondering, it is not yet released. It's going to be published soon. So here we can click on Configure and have a look what we can do. So first of all, you can change the name here. I would recommend you to go for the default name, but if a client has already implemented it, giving it a different name, you can just change it here and the tag manager will pick up the right object. Now, there is a lot of stuff provided here, and we thought it would be nice if you have all the information and documentation right in the config, so you can just click and see what the respective actions, data elements, and events can do. But of course, we also provide a link to our GitHub project, and this is going to be open source. Right. So let's see what we can do. I've set up 2 rules. I'm going to show you how I'm tracking the page load information. And then I want to show you how to interact with a typical scenario, like an asynchronous event. Let's say our stock price is updated. We have a live ticker, and this is going to be updated. So before I show you how those rules are set up, I'm going to show you how it looks like in the end. For that, I've set up a demo site. And I want to show you what happens if I push the page load information and what happens if I push the stock price update. So we can check the Adobe Data Layer. For now, it is empty. I can say get state, and it's empty. Right, so once I push the page load, and this is usually something you would do in the head of the page, of course. I've just, for the sake of the demo, I've implemented it with a button push, so you can see how it looks like. Right, so I'm going to push this, and you see I've pushed the page load event. This is the information, so I have the country, language, the title, and so on. And this already triggered my Adobe Analytics server call with all the information provided from the data layer, right? So it populates the page name, the site section, and whatever else variable you define. So we can have a look again in the data layer. We now should have this one push with an event of the page load, and the get state will, of course, show us what happened. Right, so this is the one scenario for tracking, and now I'm going to show you what we could do in the tag manager as well. I'm going to push a stock price update, and this now triggered a custom rule. In this case, it's a log to the console, but of course you could fire another analytics call, or do whatever else you want to do, right? So I trigger that again, and it's gonna fire my rule. So those rules are set up in the tag manager. Now let's have a look how this is designed. Let's start with the page load. In this rule, I always have 3 components. I have the event, which actually triggers the rule. Then I have conditions to limit the execution of the rule, and then an action. So obviously the action is I want to clear the analytics variables, set the variables, and send the beacon. And my trigger is, no big surprise, it's a data push to the ACDL. And what does it look like? We have here the option, as you have heard already today, you can listen to various things. You can listen to all changes, to all events, or just to specific events. So in our case, I just wanted to listen on the page load event. And you can also change what time scope you want to use. And it's nicely updating here the description, so you can always refer to that. Future means only fire after the data layer has been initialized. Past means you only fire for those events which have been pushed into the data layer before the data layer library has been loaded. So in our case, I just wanted to listen for all pushes of the page load. Now, the question is, how can I access this information? The event object, which will be available in the tag manager, provides you with 3 sub-elements. You have the message. So this is actually what you push into the data layer. But you can also reference the before state. So what was the state before you pushed something? And the after state. So that's the computed state. This is handy if you want to have conditions to say only fire if in the previous state something was the case or not the case. Right. So this is going to be our trigger, triggering the rule. And let's see how I can use that in analytics. Again, that's pretty straightforward. So I just populated some of my evars here. So as you can see, evar1, it's going to be event message. So as I just said, message the current information of the data layer push. And now I'm just saying page.country, page.language, user authenticated, whatever I want to set here, right? I can also use that for the default variables and reference the values. Now, I have seen there was the question already, can I use that only with Adobe Analytics, or can I use Google Analytics or other analytics solutions as well? Well, yes, of course, you can use other analytics solutions. You would just have to use a different extension here or write some custom code where you actually just take this information from the event and pass it to the respective tracking server, right? So the only thing the extension really provides you in this context is the trigger. You register yourself, for example, for the page load, and can then use that information in whatever way. You could use that for personalization or for firing marketing pixels, whatever is up to your business case. Now, I'm going to show you the stock price rule as well. It's not very different, actually. Here, I'm also listening to an event, and it's just a different name, right? So this will trigger once the stock price update is pushed. And you can see that here in the Adobe Data Layer. You can see it was the stock price update, right? And the action then is just a simple console log with a bit of formatting. And I'm just referencing here event, message, stock price. You can now imagine how you would use that in Google Analytics or in any other analytics solution. There is more of the extension. The extension also provides you with some data elements. So you can reference easily the data layer size or the current state. So this is all provided out of the box. You could say, please, this is a reference to only a specific path. It allows you to reset the data layer and so on. So there are many more things, but for the sake of simplicity now, the main focus here in this presentation is how you can interact with it. And with that, I'm just showing you there are more slides. You will receive them after the presentation and can check it out. Again, the Adobe Client Data Layer is not yet officially released. It's gonna come soon. And with that, I would say let's go over to Q&A.
Yeah, so the question is, what is the rationale behind naming the current page key dynamically in the data layer? So not sure I understand this correctly, but I guess is why do we have the page ID as a key for the within the data layer? And so, yeah, as we've shown for the core components, we use a specific structure. And for each component, we actually use the ID, HTML ID, as the key within the data layer. So, yeah.
How do we generate the IDs? It's another question.
Yeah, so for this, we have a utility, and it's actually a naming convention. So we use the name of the component, and we then add a hash of the path of the component. So to be sure that we have unique IDs for the page.
So it's not manually, it's actually dynamic. We just we reuse a method that generates it, and by leveraging the resource behind it, we can dynamically generate that ID.
So there is another question. Would it also work for components that are loaded asynchronously? So when the page loads, these components are not part of the HTML of the page?
Well, you're free to push it manually. I mean, if you are asynchronously loading components, then you're probably using JavaScript. So you can just use the same piece of code to also push the data from within the data layer. Now, that's just in the request scope, the integration that we have. It does not handle asynchronous events. Those are custom anyway, so you should
And one more thing to consider is if you push those elements later on, right, you would have to make sure that in your tracking setup, you consider that. So either you say, I'm fine with firing multiple server calls, tracking, right? Or you could say, I'm waiting until I received at least those elements and then fire one consolidated tracking call.
Yeah. So there is another question, maybe probably for Ben. How would we reference the page ID in the extension? I have seen that you can specify, you can specify a path, but when it's changing every time, how can we refer to it?
Yeah, that's a good point. So actually, for the page ID, this depends on if you use the default component page ID or not. So ideally, you would have somewhere in the structure an element which stays in the same object path, right? Like page.title. What you can do, of course, is you can always loop through the whole message object in a tag manager if you have components which have a variable amount of elements or keys.
Yeah, there's a question for the schema of the product that I used. Well, the one that you saw there is not a custom one. It's actually the one from the XDM schema of Adobe. So all those attributes that you saw there are present on the product XDM schema belonging to Adobe XDM. I'll just mark this as.
So there is another question. Currently, you have mentioned the data CMP clickable attribute. Will other events like mouse over or drag also be integrated at some point? Will this always be considered as custom? So yeah, for now we have this clickable, which is out of the box. We hadn't planned to add more out of the box, but yeah, why not? Otherwise, you would have to do that in your project.
One more thing which I really want to encourage here is it really depends on the requirements of your tracking. So using only the default values might not give you the full picture. I've worked with many clients in many industries. Usually the requirements are pretty unique. So you will have to go ahead and add some custom attributes in the data layer to be able to track what is needed to answer your business questions. All right, do we have any questions we did not answer? I think everything's answered so far.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much for your attention. It was nice having this virtual conference talk here. And looking forward to seeing the Adobe Client Data Layer implemented in more and more projects and the launch extension used in the field when it's published.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Have a nice day, everybody. And thank you.
Thank you for everybody for attending, and have a nice day.
Thanks.
See you guys.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.